Namaskar, everyone. My heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being here, especially on a post Diwali weekend. So, last topic that we discussed previous month was on the definition of yoga, wherein we talked about how it is a movement towards self-perfection and union with the divine. So this was more from a individualistic perspective, that how do we move towards our own self-perfection. But there is a larger purpose to yoga as well, a larger purpose which is beyond us. And why is it important to understand that larger purpose of yoga? Because once we understand it, once we align to that purpose, then yoga becomes more meaningful, it becomes more beautiful. So, what is that larger purpose to yoga? And that is what Sri Aurobindo describes beautifully through this chapter from the book Synthesis of Yoga. The chapter is called 3 Steps of Nature. So the word nature here means Prakriti. And nature and Prakriti can be seen by us in 2 different ways. There are 2 sides to Prakriti. If we see it from an outer perspective, as we normally see it, it appears as something mechanical and inert which is going on, sometimes more chaotic, sometimes a little bit more harmonious, but it is something which is just going on without a large purpose to it. But there is another vision to nature or Prakriti, which is the vision from inside, or a vision of faith. And when we look at Prakriti from that vision, it appears as something which is an executionary force of a divine. And that divine has a beautiful plan, and it executes that plan on earth and in this universe. And what is that plan? If we just look at the summary or the gist of that divine plan, then basically divine was an immutable, absolute being beyond this universe, which was formless, which was not created into any form. And then it created the universe. And through science, we understand it through the Big Bang theory, that the universe started with a bang and matter was created. And there in matter, the divine was hidden, and the divine was in an inert form. And from therein started a gradual process of evolution, a gradual expression of the divine in forms of various forms and larger and larger varied forms of expression of divinity in it. And that varied forms of expression of the divinity are moving back closer and closer to the divine again. And the purpose here again of the divine is to love itself in its own unity and the multiplicity in varied forms. A simple example to understand this is that, when we look at matter, when we look at atoms, molecules, they are largely inert. And in the theory of evolution, as we have understood, then the larger forms came up, the first cells came up, which had certain degree of life to them, and then plants and animals, and then mammals, and then human beings. And each one of them in the hierarchy depict a higher and higher potential, to express the divinity within them. So this is how the divine plan is unfolding in form of an evolution, and the larger purpose here is to reach back to the divine, have another union with the divine through the universe and love itself. So if we look at this larger plan with the purpose of evolution and more expression, it gives a larger meaning to yoga. And in this evolutionary process, we can largely see three aspects. There are some things which are already evolved, there are some things which are still evolving, and there are some things which are yet to evolve. And when we look at what has already evolved, it is the human body. Sri Aurobindo in this chapter quotes Upanishads, where the divine offered various forms that it had created on this earth to the gods, and they rejected it, whether it's animals or plants. And only when the human form was created that they said that this indeed is perfect, and they consented to enter the human form. And what makes this human form perfect? It is the sense of equilibrium that it has. When we look at any living form, it is largely can be seen as physical matter, which is inert, in which life force has been infused. So life force is a dynamic force which brings things to life, which generates an urge to live, which brings movement to things. So therein, the human form or the human body that has been created has two aspects. One is it is sufficiently durable and steady. One can see and compare it to a monkey. That's a good example because it's very restless and is moving from one place to the other, vis-a-vis a human body form, which is more durable, it's more steady, it has the more likely ability to house the peace of the divine as well. It has a certain length of life, and at the same time, yet it is pliable and flexible, which can be simply understood by the example of yoga. That if we look at Hatha Yoga, through Hatha Yoga, the body can be put into different postures. If we look at the potential of the body, by when we say that this is indeed made perfect, it doesn't mean that it's perfect and set in stone, it doesn't change, but actually it has that pliability or flexibility to evolve and to modify to the needs of the purpose. So from that perspective, it is a fit instrument to yoga. To give you more examples, there have been people who have practiced Surya Yoga, which is basically they have lived on sunlight. And there have been people who have pretty much lived on breath. So largely the point is that this physical body has a large, flexible, pliable potential, and yet it has the durability and steadiness to house the peace as well. And that is where the nature in this physical form that we have, which we are all grateful for, has created this equilibrium. Just to elaborate a bit more on the life force which is added to the matter through which these forms are created, living forms are created. When for the first time a cell was created by adding that life force, it created within it an urge to live. And when we talk about this urge to live, it basically means that it perpetuates its survival through acquiring food, through reproduction and procreation, by protecting itself. So an inbuilt mechanism was set in the matter and in form of in any living creature to help it survive. And when this survival happened in the life force, and as the beings evolved, this life force also, as the mind was created in the beings, this life force also impacted the mind. And there the life force expressed itself in forms of emotions. In the physical, it expressed itself in form of feelings, and in the mind, it expressed itself in form of emotions. To give an example, when we are hungry at that time, we do feel a sense of a void or a feeling, gurgling sound in the tummy, which is a feeling. And that is again a creation of the life force or the prana within. And at the same time, a person may feel irritable, which is an emotion. So the life force impacting our mind and our emotions. When we eat food and we are satiated, there is a sense of fullness that we experience. So that is a feeling one experiences in the physical body. And at the same time, there may be a satisfaction or a sense of pleasure that one may derive from eating food. That is an expression of the same in the terms of emotions. Now, in general, we are not able to differentiate between the two because they are happening almost simultaneously. But if we reflect upon it, we would be able to clearly differentiate between the physicality, the life force aspect of it, and the mental and emotional aspect of it. So similarly, we can see it not just from the example of eating, we can also see it from the example of procreation, where a sense of craving has been created, a sense of satisfaction or a pleasure has been created, and same with protecting oneself. Now, this mechanism was largely set in to any living creature for the purpose of survival. But in the higher and higher forms, which specifically talks about human beings, there has been an overindulgence in this life force, this urge to live, this survival instinct. And where there has been an overindulgence, there has been a certain degree of perversion, and it also acts like a distraction from the path of yoga or from the larger purpose of nature or the divine plan of yoga. So when it acts, and it is so strongly ingrained within us that it is not something so easy to let go or transform. And that from there arose in many forms of yoga an eventual aim of mukti from physical life, or some way to liberate oneself from the physical life, and so that it is easier to experience the divine at a more, it's easy to understand that it's easier to feel the divine at the mental level or at a spiritual level. So a final recoil from the physical body seemed like a very apt answer to this obstacle which physical form offers to the yogic process. But if we understand now from the discussion that we have had just now about the larger purpose of yoga, it is to fulfill and express the divinity more and more from inert matter to higher and higher forms, then it doesn't, any yogic practice which doesn't include the perfection and transformation of the physical life doesn't seem like a complete answer. Yes, it is full of obstacles, that is absolutely true. But there Sri Aurobindo puts in a beautiful and a very convincing argument, which I'll read out to you, that the obstacle which the physical presents to the spiritual is no argument for the rejection of the physical. We just talked about how physical is an obstacle to the spiritual, but that's not an argument that one can give to reject the physical aspect. For in the unseen providence of things, our greatest difficulties are our best opportunities. Now, herein, Sri Aurobindo talks about a very basic wisdom of living life, that wherever lie our greatest difficulties, we can sulk over them that, oh, it's so difficult, it is a problem, what can I do about it? But in a very basic principle of psychology, each difficulty can also be seen as an opportunity. And when we see something as an opportunity, we really open up to it and allow ourselves to grow. And he continues to write, a supreme difficulty is nature's indication to us of a supreme conquest to be won, an ultimate problem to be solved. So this is the ultimate problem to be solved, and we are here to all contribute as the divine warriors to solve that problem and not run away from it. And same is for the life force as well, as we talked about the physical. To give a very simple analogy, as we've discussed how it impacts the body and the mind, but from the purpose of yoga, what does life force mean to us? A simple analogy is fire. Life force is that fire which fires the aspiration within us to practice yoga. It is the fire of sacrifice in the yoga. It is the fire which fuels the love within us for the divine. It is the fire which takes hold of the fervor in meditation. Meditation is not just about sitting down in peace. It takes a lot of fervor to meditate, and this is that fire. And it contributes to the illumination of the mind. So, life force is something which just does not have to be annulled or destroyed. And here again, Sri Aurobindo writes, life force purification, not destruction. Its transformation, control, and utilization is the aim in view with which they have been created and developed in us. So it doesn't have to be destroyed, it has to be purified and transformed. And since we said that life force is a it's a energy, and we know that energy cannot be destroyed or created. It can only be transformed. So herein it has to be purified and transformed so that the fire can be activated within us for its true purpose. So what we discussed just now from a physical and the life force perspective is that part which is already evolved within us. As we discussed, there are three parts. One is evolved, the second is what is evolving, and the third, which is yet to evolve. The evolved part can be seen as a car, which is ready for use. It needs regular cleaning, it needs that transformation, but it is ready to use. What is evolving is the driver sitting within the car, and that driver to a degree is our mind. And this mind also can be seen as in largely divided into three parts. There is a mind which is the mind, material and nervous, which is absolutely absorbed within the body in terms of our nervous system. There is an intellectual mind, and then there is a divine mind. To understand the mind material or the nervous mind, it is the one which is present in all life forms, which are living beings to a degree, whether it's the plants or the animals. But there it is largely imprisoned within the body. It cannot move out of it, and it is largely there. And this is the mind which is most impacted by the life force, and through which the survival instinct is created. And this is the mind which keeps us absorbed in our own daily life in trying to meet our survival needs. So that is the mind material which is driven by pleasure and pain. The second is the intellectual mind, and this intellectual mind is the one which is evolved to a degree that it can get us out of the illusion of the senses. which can rise above the physical sensations and help us discriminate and see things in their own truth. To give you a simple example, if you look at sun and earth, the relationship between sun and earth, from a very mind, material and nervous perspective, we would see sun rising from the east and setting from the west, and it is seemingly going around us. But when the intellectual mind started to develop, it started to reason, it started to create tools, it started to question what the sensory experience it is, and based on a lot of observations, discrimination, it concluded that it is not that sun is going around the earth, but earth is going around the sun. So in a way, we have moved above the sensory realm. Another very common example that is given to describe intellect is of a diagram wherein different words, different colors are spelled out as red, yellow, and they are given a different color. Say, for example, red is written in a green color, yellow is written in a blue color, and a person is asked to read them out. Again, from a very basic mind perspective, we instinctively read out what is written. If red is written, then red will be read out even if it is written in a green color. But when we start using our intellect in the process, only then we are able to manage to do the task of seeing the color in it rather than reading it. So this process requires that faculty of intellect than just the mind material. This is a very common example which is given for people to understand what exactly buddhi or intellect means and how one can sharpen that buddhi or intellect within us. From a medical perspective, it requires a lot of alignment between the right and the left brain. So it's simple to understand that for us, from the purpose of yoga, it allows us to understand the purpose of yoga. It allows you and me to rise above the sensory realm. And therein, the meaning of the true human existence first arrives. And here Sri Aurobindo beautifully writes, the true human existence, therefore, only begins when the intellectual mentality emerges out of the material. So the intellectual mentality is what we talked about. It moves out of just material living, and we begin more and more to live in the mind, independent of the nervous and physical obsession. So he uses the word nervous and physical obsession to describe this indulgence in the basic needs of life, and it starts to live independent of it in the mind. And in the measure of that liberty, are able to accept rightly. So in the measure of the liberty means to the degree of proportion it has the liberty over the physical living, it is able to accept rightly. So now it is not just about living independent of the physical body. Physical body is very important. It is the basis of living. So it has to be accepted now in its right purpose and rightly to use the life of the body. So a liberation from the mind, an acceptance of it with its true meaning, and then a proper use of this body. That is where the true human existence begins, when a person starts to live there. So when we talk about this intellectual evolution that is happening within the universe and as a part of the yoga of nature, the nature has taken large leaps in it, and the intellectual development is something which is currently going on. And in this process of intellectual development, there lies a big challenge for the nature and for us. because the mind material, the life force, and the physical has already been created into a certain equilibrium by the nature. But when the intellectual development starts to happen, it is yet to be equilibrated with these three lower aspects. A simple example for that is again the geniuses or the scientists around, which largely live in their mind and their mental sphere. And it is very common to see them in a very disheveled appearance. And that is because there is that lack of equilibrium. In the process of intellectual living, they have forgotten to take care of the physicality. So that is the next step in the yoga of nature, where the intellectual living is equilibrated with the physical and the life force based living. But is there something beyond the intellectual mind as well? Is there a divine mind also which is yet to evolve or is evolving? So that can be best understood by an age-old concept of Panch Koshas, which has been given out in the yogic systems. Koshas mean layers or sheets, and Panch obviously means 5. So the 5 layers or 5 sheets or 5 bodies is how the yogic systems have looked at human system as. It is made of these 5 layers. The first 3 layers we have been talking about till now, which is the Annamaya Kosha, which is made out of Ann. Ann means food. So it is the physical body, which is largely made out of food. And then there is the Pranamaya Kosha, which is the pranic body. Prana represents the life force. So that is the Pranamaya Kosha. And then there is the Manomaya Kosha, which is the mind body, which we just discussed in terms of the mind material, mind nervous, and the intellectual mind. So here again in these 3 layers, how beautifully the Pranamaya Kosha lies between the Annamaya Kosha and the Manomaya Kosha, because it is largely impacting both. And it's like a current which passes through both and can again be understood. We understand the word prana through pranayam, and pranayam is largely a breath-based process. And in that breath-based process, we see people when they do pranayam, their body feels much better and their mind also calms down. So breath and pranayam are strongly linked to each other, and through breath we can impact our physical body, our pran, and also our mental body as well. So beyond these 3 bodies are 2 more bodies to a human system, and those 2 bodies are the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the Anandamaya Kosha. So Vijnanamaya Kosha, to understand it from our own perspective, in our ordinary life, we all at a certain level understand intuition and have felt intuition at some time in our life. And that intuition or that inspiration gives us a knowledge of something which is to happen or which needs to be done, and it has a strong feeling attached to it as if it's the truth. And that intuition, in the scientific terms, has also been linked to being in the zone. It's a term which has come up in the past 20 to 30 years, where lots of scientists and sports persons have described that when they have been in states of high levels of concentration, they have had a very natural action of perfection, a certain knowing, whether it's tennis players or cricketers. They've described this experience that they would know how and when the next thing is going to happen. And the beautiful, perfect action just flows through them rather than them thinking it out. It just spontaneously happens. So this is the window through which we can look into the Vijnanamaya Kosha, which is a space of all knowing. Another analogy to Vijnanamaya Kosha is sun. As sun is self-luminous, it has spontaneous knowledge, Vijnanamaya Kosha. The knowledge here is not, if we take an object X at the Manomaya Kosha level, we would reflect on that X object, we would read about it, we would understand it, and then draw conclusions with our intellectual mind about it. But at a Vijnanamaya Kosha level, there is a spontaneous knowing of that object. So this is like a sun. The knowledge just flows out spontaneously out of it. And very strongly associated with it is the Anandamaya Kosha, which is the bliss body. Now, Sri Aurobindo very beautifully writes that this bliss is not the supreme pleasure of the heart or the senses. The heart and the sensory feelings and emotions have been built in with a duality. If we feel that supreme pleasure, there is an equal and opposite pain which is waiting for us. If there is a supreme joy, there is an equal and opposite sorrow which is waiting for us. If there is a love with attachment, there is an equal and opposite anger and frustration waiting for us. And all these heart and sensory emotions which we feel are generally driven by a trigger from outside. If this happens, I feel the pleasure. If this doesn't happen, I feel the pain. Whereas this is a self-existent, absolute, spontaneous outflowing of an emotion of bliss, which doesn't require the heart, which doesn't require the sensations. In our ordinary living, if there is any emotion which gets close to this bliss, is a feeling of happiness which we experience in doing something selflessly. That feeling of doing something selflessly, that happiness that we feel, is largely not so fleeting. It just stays with us. And why does it stay with us? Because it takes us closer to that Anandamaya Kosha, that Vijnanamaya Kosha, and it is closer to that bliss. The other aspect or another concept around the Panch Koshas that we need to understand is that these two bodies, the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the Anandamaya Kosha, they are together called as the causal bodies. And the lower three layers, or the layers of physical, mental and the pranic body, is called as the instrument body. So the causal body is the Karan body and the instrument body is the Karan body through which the action happens. This can be one of the common questions that we have, which arises to us, is that if we all have an all-knowing and all-blissful body within us, then we should have a supreme ability, all of us. So the instrument body is such that, to give an example, that within the divinity or within the causal body, if there are 1,000 songs, then in the instrument body, there will be only a specific number of songs which will be expressed. The instrument bodies are a derivation or a selection of the causal body. If a singer knows 1,000 songs, it's not necessary that he goes out on a stage and he will sing all his 1,000 songs. He may choose to sing 1 or 2 songs which are expressed through a certain physical, for a certain event, and he may choose to sing another song for the another event. So same way, the divine has millions of songs, and through different instrumental bodies, it expresses different songs, and that gives us each one of us our own uniqueness in our instrumental form, which is our physical body. This also, the causal and the effective form, the causal and the instrument body, can also be seen and in the top-down causation, that the things first happen at the level of the causal body and then they manifest down at the level of the physical realm. Being a doctor, I can give you a very simple example through medical field. For example, somebody is experiencing a chronic stomach ache and they repeatedly get stomach aches. It can be something just at a physical level, wherein they are getting infected again and again, or there is some food which is not suiting them or something like that. And we fix them, it gets better. But if it is something which is larger than this, it may be something which is at the pranic body level. Their life force is not moving well, and therein the pranayama comes in and they start doing the pranic yoga practices and they feel better, their stomach feels better. But it may not be just something at a pranic, at a physical, it may not be an infection, it may not be just a blockage. It may be related to the mind. There is something disturbing that person at an emotional level. And no matter how much pranayama he does, he feels fleetingly better. No matter how much antibiotics he takes, he feels fleetingly better. But the issue keeps coming back again and again. And therein, when you work on the mental aspect of the issue, when you work on certain emotional scars that the person is carrying, you help release those, the person feels better. But yet there is a possibility that the person continues to have the issue. And therein comes when the person actually meets his self, when the person gets associated with the larger purpose of his life, when the person gets connected to this subtler element within him, does the spontaneous healing arise. And that becomes the most complete healing. And that is the concept of top-down causation. One can go, it doesn't mean that working on infections or the mental belief systems or the pranic blockages is not important. It is equally important because the spontaneous healing actually has to happen through the physicality, but that element is truly essential to any form of healing. And that is the concept of top-down causation, can be seen in any aspect of life. And this subtle Vijnanamaya Kosha and Anandamaya Kosha within us is also linked to the element which is the transcendent, which is beyond this universe, which is the absolute truth, which is the all blissful Sat Chit Ananda, which is the truth, the consciousness, the divine will, and the bliss of the divine. We will be discussing more in detail. It's an elaborate topic, Satchidananda, but there is an element which is the absolute divine beyond this universe, and our access to that Satchit Ananda is the Anandamaya Kosha and the Vijnanamaya Kosha. And this Anandamaya Kosha and Vijnanamaya Kosha and Satchidananda experience is so beautiful, it is so dazzling, that one then tends to forget about the physicality of the being. And therein we see two common errors arising within the human sphere. One common error is that one starts living up there in the transcendent being or in this blissful, beautiful state, forgetting the physical body. And in that case, again, the person doesn't complete the larger purpose of yoga, which we have just discussed. Or there may be the error on the other side, that the person may feel that I can see the physical body, I can feel the prana, I can feel the mental body, I understand that I have thoughts. This is what is tangible. I don't know about the Vijnanamaya Kosha or the Anandamaya Kosha and those aspects. So I rather not go there. This is too subjective for me. And let me just limit myself to the first three layers and work upon them to the best of my ability and live my life there. But therein the error happens of not realizing one's fullest potential, or not meeting the larger purpose of yoga again. And one may become good in the process by perfecting the mental, the pranic, and the physical, but one may not become the best of what they can be. If there has been anyone who has ever striven to be the best of what they can be, they have knowingly or unknowingly connected to that deeper element within. So with this, I summarize and read out the last few lines of this chapter, 3 Steps of Nature. The ultimate, the integral yoga is that which, having found the transcendent, can return upon the universe and possess it. So it goes beyond to the Satchidananda and then comes back to the universe possessing it, retaining the power freely to descend as well as ascend the great stair of existence. So the person is free to descend and ascend back in the layers of the human system freely, and not just get locked up in either up there or down below. These 3 steps in the nature: a bodily life which is the basis of our existence. So the bodily life is the basis but not the aim. A mental life into which we emerge and by which we raise the bodily to higher uses and enlarge it into a greater completeness. So we emerge from the bodily to a mental life which raises the body to its full use, and a divine existence which is at once the goal of the other two and returns upon them to liberate them to their higher possibilities. So the first is the physical, second is the mental, and third is the divine, which is not just the goal of the yoga, but also it comes down and liberates the other two for their best possibilities, are the 3 steps of the nature. And regarding none of them as either beyond our reach, so we do not see the Satchidananda or the layers Vijnanamaya Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha beyond us, or seeing some of the layers below our nature. So if somebody has experienced the blissful state, he doesn't see the physical realm as something below him, and the destruction of none of them as essential to the ultimate attainment. So none of them are destroyed, all of them are respected, and all of them are liberated and fulfilled. So to summarize, we talked about, number 1, the larger purpose of yoga. We talked about the 5 layers to a human system. We talked about the 2 common errors we can make in the process of discovering these layers. And finally, we talked about what integral yoga truly means from Sri Aurobindo's perspective. I'd like to call upon Dr. Bijlani to share his insights on the same topic. Thank you.
The chapter from the Synthesis of Yoga that Dr. Mankul Goyal has just discussed is titled The 3 Steps of Nature. I'm glad that he started with clarifying what really Sri Aurobindo means by nature here. Because in the modern world and with the westernized intellect, many of us have a great reluctance to accepting the idea of God or the spirit. And nature looks like an acceptable alternative to these ideas, the existence of a superhuman, a supernatural power, and that's the way nature is looked at. Nature is acceptable, God is not. But in terms of spiritual ideas, nature is the executive power of the divine itself. So the Purusha and the Prakriti, the consenting power and the executing power are not really separate. They are one. They are 2 aspects of the same. And that is the sense in which nature has been used here. And the three steps that Sri Aurobindo talks about are in terms of evolution. Now, evolution means the gradual revealing or unfolding of something that is already inherent. So, when the one, divine, decided to manifest itself in a material form, it became many, but then at the same time it became dead matter, which was such a contrast with the divine itself. Just imagine the all-knowing, all-powerful divine becoming something that apparently can do nothing and apparently knows nothing. Now, but at the same time, that consciousness of the divine did not really disappear, and in the course of evolution, it has been revealing itself bit by bit in small steps. And it is these three major steps that Sri Aurobindo has talked about in this chapter. The first step that he has talked about is that of the bodily life. Although progressing from dead matter to a living being itself was a big leap, but for making the chapter concise and more relevant to the present context, Sri Aurobindo has combined the two, and the first step is bodily life, that is a physical body which has been charged with a spark of life. And just sort of reflect over a bit, and you would see what an amazing transformation this subtle spark of life brings about in dead matter. Matter which seemed to be capable of doing nothing now has going on within it a remarkable process in which different physico-chemical mechanisms and processes create this phenomenon, this marvelous phenomenon that we call life. It's an amazing change that comes about in this matter, and it is not because something fresh has been injected into it, but in fact the possibilities of life were already inherent in matter because it had in it that entire consciousness of the divine, and it has now revealed itself in the form of this phenomenon that we call life. The second step was the evolution of creatures which had a mind. And this mind, Sri Aurobindo says, has three aspects. And the first aspect is the emotions. Now, emotions and the life force are very closely linked. So in a way, we cannot really split them and separate them completely. And Sri Aurobindo talks about both of them as the vital, one as the physical vital, and the other, you might say, as the vital, which is a part of the mind, or the nervous vital, as he calls it sometimes. So it is these two which cannot be split. Why they cannot be split is because life is not just the ability to live, but also the urge to live. Even a primitive organism which does not have a mind seems to have an urge to live because it, maybe in a mechanical way, but it tries to move towards wherever it finds food, and it tries to move away from wherever it finds some danger to itself. So it seeks food, avoids danger, because it not only has the capacity to live, but also the urge to live. Now, when the mind evolved, the first aspect of the mind to evolve was also that which strengthened this urge to live by coupling it with emotions. And that's further strengthened the urge to live because, as Dr. Mankul Goyal just mentioned, that say food is essential for life. When we don't have food, we feel miserable, and when we find food, we feel happy. So, if for nothing else, an animal would try to find food to escape the misery of hunger and in anticipation of the pleasure that it will get when it finds the food. We find it even more acutely in case of air. If a person is deprived of air for even a few minutes, then the person is absolutely miserable, suffocating, and getting a bit of air can bring such an intense relief to the person. So this is how the capacity to live and the urge to live go together, and the urge to live got further strengthened by coupling it with emotions. And these aspects have got totally harmonized. which means that we really cannot split them, the body, the life force, and these emotions which further strengthen the urge to live, they are totally harmonized. But there's another aspect of the mind which is still not totally harmonized, and that is the intellect. So the intellect is not fully harmonized because it is not really able to always work in harmony with the emotional part of the being. It has evolved later, and therefore it should be leading human beings, because it's human beings in whom the intellect is really very well developed. Most of the animals live at the physical vital level. For them to be able to live and to have a strong urge to find food and a mate, because the species also has to continue, is quite enough. So basically animals are feeding and breeding creatures. But human being has gone beyond that because of the intellect. But the intellect is still not fully harmonized with the part of the mind that evolved earlier, because ideally, since it has evolved later, it should be leading man, but instead of leading, very often, the physical vital man seems to follow it. What it means is that we live primarily through emotions rather than through the intellect. Although the intellect is there to govern and moderate our feelings, but the feelings can be so compelling that they end up exploiting the intellect, and we end up listening to the intellect. Something like, the intellect trying to tell the emotional part of the being, can I guide you? And the emotional part of the being saying that yes, you can, but you may not. So it doesn't always allow the intellect to guide, even if it is for something better. Of course, there may be a hidden purpose to this also, because in human beings, as Mankul just mentioned, the emotional part of the being has overstepped its boundaries seen in animals. It's no longer just creating in us a stronger urge to eat and to procreate. It is also the power that leads us to heroic deeds. Whether it is climbing the Everest, or going into outer space, or somebody just getting overcome by his compassion for his fellow beings and donating all his life's savings in charity. Any of these things is done under a spell of emotions, not because of cool, calculated thinking. If a person does that, then the person will quickly step back and see, I'm not so stupid, I'm not going to do any of these things. So the reason why a person does all these things, takes risks, loses something willingly, is because of emotions. So emotions do have a role to play, an important role to play in making man a better man, but at the same time, emotions are a double-edged weapon. The greatest of things man does under a spell of emotions, but the worst of things also happen under emotions. Because in human beings, because of, as Mankul mentioned, overindulgence of the emotions, a person may not eat just to satisfy hunger, as animals generally do. A human being may eat also out of greed, a type of food that he really likes. If a person relishes food, he may eat more than he needs, and that is why we find that natural obesity is by and large restricted to human beings. Animals grow fat only when they are in the company of human beings. You don't find fat animals living in the wild. They don't overeat. As soon as they are full, they stop eating, even if food is there in front of them. So that way, human being does the worst of things also under that. And the same way, when it comes to sex, human being is probably the only animal who doesn't indulge in sex just for procreation, but has made it a sort of a pleasure which he enjoys in itself, quite independent of the purpose of procreation. So human beings can also overindulge, and therefore they can grow fat, and we can have all types of sex-related crimes like rapes and etc. Now all that means that this emotional part of the being is a double-edged weapon. It can work for the good and it can work for the bad, and therefore it does need to be harnessed or sort of kept in check, and that is what the intellect has evolved for, but the intellect is unable to do so because it has not yet harmonized with the physical and the vital. The vital is harmonized totally with the body, but the intellect that part of the mind has not yet fully harmonized with the rest of the parts of the being, the physical and the vital, which evolved earlier. The intellect has not yet fully harmonized with them. But that is where the intellect is. So you can say that intellect is a work in progress. In terms of evolution, it is still developing, and even in human beings, it has not been able to harmonize with the physical and the vital. But then Sri Aurobindo also talks about the third aspect of the mind, the divine mind. That is a mind which doesn't work necessarily on the basis of rationality, but in fact goes beyond rationality and reveals itself through inspiration, intuition, and revelation. These are also aspects of the mind, and these are aspects which are also there in the human being, and they are yet to evolve, which means that within the mind we have three aspects. One is the vital mind, the emotional mind, which evolved first and has totally harmonized with the physical and the vital. The second aspect is the intellect, which is still in the process of getting harmonized with what evolved earlier. And the third is the divine mind, which is yet to evolve, but we get glimpses of it from time to time in individuals, and in some more substantially, in a more substantial measure, so that these human beings then stand apart from the rest of us. So these are the people whom we call our saints and sages. And so we have these three aspects of the mind. Now one may get the impression that from here, from the divine mind to progress towards what was mentioned as the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the Anandamaya Kosha, which would be a way of looking at the supramental, which Sri Aurobindo has talked about. From there to the supramental will be one linear progression. But then another beautiful thing about evolution is that it is not a steady and linear progression. There are also retreats, as Sri Aurobindo calls them. Now, what does this mean? What it means is that in the process of further evolution, it doesn't necessarily mean that what has already evolved necessarily keeps getting better. And if you just look around, it's so obvious. Cows can live on grass, human beings can't. A horse can run at 50 kilometers an hour, a human being can't. And a dog can smell things which a human being can't. So there are so many things which animals can do. A monkey can jump from a tree to another, one tree to the other, which human beings can't. So many things which animals can do, which human beings can't. Which means that in the evolution process of evolving of the intellect, certain capacities have been lost. And therefore, it's quite possible that in the course of evolving from the intellect to the divine mind, and from the divine mind to the supramental, the human being may lose some of the abilities, particularly the intellectual abilities. Why I'm bringing this up is because the mother has in fact talked about it. She says it's quite possible that the supramental creature that will evolve will not be as intelligent as a human being. So it's not that what has already evolved will necessarily keep getting better. And then she has pointed out, said something very beautiful, how this may be useful in the evolution of the supramental creature, becoming less intelligent. Because that is how man will lose his ability to deceive himself and others. It's a very profound statement, just reflect over it. Man is able to cheat himself and others so effectively only because he is extremely intelligent. Animals can't do it. And therefore, by losing a bit of his intellect, and on the other hand, expressing more of his divinity as our saints and sages do, a human being might find it easier to become one with the divine. And what is this evolution ultimately leading to? It's leading to the saints and sages, those who have gone beyond the intellect to the divine mind, and from the divine mind to the super mind, becoming more and more of the norm rather than an exception. Which means the divine, instead of remaining that remote, nameless, faceless divine to us, starts manifesting in the forms on this earth, the one also expressing itself through plurality. And it already does that. The one is expressing itself through its plurality in the universe. But then, at least on this planet, that plurality expresses only a small fraction of the Supreme Consciousness. If on this very earth itself, that plurality is coupled with a full or a much more substantial expression of that divinity, then that would be, in a way, the ultimate goal towards which the divine is working, that is, becoming the one and the many simultaneously, expressing itself in the many almost fully, and also simultaneously existing as the one. So this apparent paradox of oneness and plurality, both expressing the Supreme Consciousness, the peak consciousness of the divine, would be the ultimate reconciliation, and something which we can only imagine, but at the same time, that is what will take us to that bliss, that Anandamaya Kosha, which Mankul said, because that is the only way. With partial manifestation, there will always be a duality of joy and sorrow. It is only in that state that one can be in a state of self-existent bliss. Bliss coming from the very fact of existing, which is inherent in the existence, which will be devoid of that duality, and therefore will be more of a sort of a steady peace, rather than the waves of excitement which we call pleasure and sometimes joy at a little higher level, but all the same, even joy is coupled with sorrow. Without that coupling, what will be left behind with will be a steady peace, and that is what bliss is perhaps about.